Assassins just cut the power to a Mafia kingpin's penthouse. But they forgot his roommate is blind. When rival mobsters stormed Paul Sawyer's glass tower and plunged it into total darkness, his heavily armed guards panicked. A gunshot rang out, and the ruthless boss was hit. But while the assassins thought they had the upper hand in the pitch black, Patricia didn't need light. She had memorized exactly 12 steps to a hidden panic room. Now the blind waitress was about to save the monster.
Let us look closely at Patricia together. You and I are going to step into the shadows of a mind desperately fighting for control. The camera follows her worn shoes in a rigid rhythm. 47 steps from the diner to the first table. 11 to the coffee station. 4 left, avoiding a cracked tile. This rigid counting is the exhausting rhythm of deep trauma. She memorized that diner to anchor her fragile psyche. But the subway was a different beast. A sensory minefield she could not predict. The sudden rustle of paper bags, the stinging scent of cheap nail polish. The city mutated every night, violently stripping away her boundaries and leaving her exposed to predators. It reminds us that trauma forces people to build invisible walls just to survive the ordinary world. Let the lens pull back for a moment. Profound exhaustion leaves the human body dangerously vulnerable to manipulation. Patricia stood gripping the cold metal pole, her wooden cane wedged tightly between trembling knees. She anchored herself to the only static truth she had left. 14 stops until the quiet safety of an empty room. Her nervous system was actively shutting out the burning pain in her heels after a brutal double shift. She had just served arrogant men who tossed her a calculated tip to absolve their own guilt. $61. She counted those crumpled bills twice in the dim break room. It is a tragic ritual of survival. We all tend to create small, predictable routines when we feel ourselves slowly drowning in a world that demands far too much. We must examine the cold math of poverty and how it fractures the human spirit. Her electric bill was $78, but she only had 61. 12 stops remained when the world violently betrayed her. A jarring reroute pitched the train sideways, shattering fragile pattern. Her numb fingers slipped from the metal, and her cane clattered down. Notice her body language here. A healthy person braces for impact, but Patricia chose to fall. Trained by years of quiet rejection, she refused to grab blindly. Creating a scene would only validate the cruel assumption strangers make in seconds. She surrendered to gravity. It is a stark reminder that sometimes people will willingly endure physical pain just to escape the suffocating weight of public pity. But the punishing impact never came. Instead, the camera catches her colliding with an unexpected force. Warmth, the dense, grounding weight of a man's lap, and the friction of high-grade wool against her cheek. She stammered a panicked apology, trying to pull back. But her biology staged a quiet mutiny. Her aching muscles rebelled against her fear, recognizing the heavy safety of this foreign structure. Then a hand descended onto her trembling shoulder. It was not restraining her, but claiming her, placed with the chilling authority of a man who has never been denied. He uttered one single word. "Don't," a low command that bypassed her ears. It teaches us a grim truth about vulnerability. When we are utterly exhausted, even the darkest shadows can masquerade as a safe place to rest. The low command vibrated through her bones. Now stick with me here, because we need to observe the shifting dynamics in this dimly lit car. The air went dead quiet. It is a primitive reaction when an apex predator alters the pressure of a room. Patricia could not process the threat. She could not see the violent ink crawling up his throat, or the brutal syndicate tattoos across his knuckles. These symbols triggered immediate fear in everyone else. She missed the terrified expressions of the man across the aisle hiding behind his phone. She failed to register the couple, shrinking toward the exit doors. She was entirely blind to the monster holding her. It is a haunting reminder that our inability to see the whole picture can sometimes lead us straight into the waiting arms of danger. In the language of trauma, this is where the tragic dissonance begins. All Patricia registered was the deceptive gentleness of his hand. Defying decades of sharp survival instincts, her exhausted brain simply failed to signal fear. The physical weight on her shoulder silently instructed her to stay, bypassing all rational defenses. Patricia, a tired waitress with exactly $61, surrendered her autonomy. She kept her cheek anchored to the expensive wool of a dangerous sociopath. For the first time in years, she closed her eyes and stopped scanning the shadows. This profound vulnerability is the exact dark soil required for a toxic bond to grow. It is a hard truth that extreme isolation can make any shelter feel like genuine care, even from a deeply destructive source. She believed she had 14 stops of safe harbor, unaware he was already mapping out the rest of her existence. Let us pan over to Paul Sawyers. He possessed the dark profile of a true psychopath. Constantly calculating variables, he remained devoid of human sentiment. He measured his life in lethal percentages and the seconds it took to break a rival's spirit. Paul operated strictly within absolute control. Unconscious women falling on midnight trains were never part of his plans. Yet an anomaly occurred tonight. A failure with his private driver unexpectedly forced him onto the public transit system at 51st Street. It goes to show how life can turn on a single unpredictable axis, effortlessly throwing a fragile person directly into the violent path of an incoming storm. Men like Paul Sawyers despise public spectacles they do not orchestrate. Despite the terrifying rumors whispered about him, he absorbed the inconvenience. He claimed a dark corner seat, wrapped in a bespoke suit, intending to strategize an extortion contract. Then the train lurched, injecting chaos into his sterile world. Someone collapsed directly onto him, ignorant of his lethal status. Her cane hit the floor. She did not scream. Her tired head dropped against his thigh, and she emitted a barely audible sound. This utter lack of fear fundamentally disrupted his unyielding superiority complex. It is a fascinating psychological twist. It shows us how genuine innocence and quiet vulnerability can deeply unsettle even the most powerful, untouchable figures in a corrupted world. It was a soft sound suspended between a weary sigh and total surrender. "You and I are going to unpack his move together." She went instantly still. Not unconscious, but profoundly asleep. Paul studied her face with the cold curiosity of a scientist dissecting a specimen. He silently cataloged her vulnerabilities. The frayed edge of her collar, the hardened callus on her palm, forged by years of gripping a cane. He inhaled the breakdown of her environment. Stale coffee and grease, masked by cheap floral spray. To a predator whose entire life was built on leveraging weakness, her exhaustion was an exploitable resource. It reminds us that highly toxic individuals rarely look for equals to love. They look for deep existing fractures they can exploit for absolute control. Why did he not push her away? His failure to discard her reveals a twisted proprietary instinct. A passenger nearby, fueled by the confidence of cheap liquor, noticed Patricia's vulnerability. He leaned in with the predatory smile of a friendly stranger. Paul executed a minimal, highly calibrated response. He simply turned his head. It was a slow rotation, radiating the lethal promise of a man who dismantles lives for a living. The intoxicated stranger immediately shrank into a submissive posture, obsessed with his phone, never daring to make eye contact again. Then a drifting teenager unconsciously breached their perimeter. It highlights a chilling reality about human dynamics. Dark power rarely needs to raise its voice. A quiet, terrifying presence is enough to enforce absolute boundaries. The teenager was riding the midnight train, but Paul demanded absolute compliance. He lifted a single finger, pointing to a handrail 6 feet away. The boy relocated instantly, obeying an ancient instinct to flee a lethal threat. For 11 stops, Paul projected a suffocating field of terror, maintaining a sterile bubble around the sleeping woman through sheer psychological weight. There was no loud altercation, just the gravity of a man who understood that true violence is most effective when implicitly promised. Meanwhile, Patricia's destination arrived and vanished, while he quietly memorized her home address. It is a haunting lesson in psychological control. Predators do not always forcefully drag you away. Sometimes they just patiently wait for you to sleep past your only safe exit. She tagged her cane with an emergency card, a tragic coping mechanism for a vulnerable soul. Yet she remained comatose against him. As the train terminated, a janitor approached. He assessed the lethal stillness radiating from Paul and wisely vanished into the shadows. Sitting in the empty car, Paul evaluated Patricia with the clinical detachment he used for hostile takeovers. She was neither a strategic liability nor a financial asset. She was a fragile organism that had collapsed onto him, completely devoid of manipulative intent. In his paranoid existence, every interaction was a calculated transaction. To find someone without a hidden agenda was a dangerous trigger. It teaches a chilling life lesson. Absolute innocence often acts as a powerful magnet for the most possessive forms of darkness. There was no grand deception on her part. She simply collapsed. Paul pulled his phone from his pocket, his voice flat as he called for his car. He just sat in the quiet, watching the steady rise and fall of her chest until a dark sedan rolled up to the gate. Think about this for a moment. It shows us a brutal reality. When we are completely starved for peace, we easily fall asleep in the jaws of a trap. He picked her up with terrifying care, making sure her exhausted body did not jolt awake. His watch marked 1:07 in the morning, 41 minutes of lost time. He had already chosen to erase her freedom, packing her away like a stolen prize. When Patricia finally woke up, the first thing that hit her was a crushing, heavy silence. The frame opens on absolute darkness. This is not the familiar grit of her old place on Delancey Street, where broken pipes groaned and noise seeped through cheap drywall. This silence is heavy, artificial, and bought with dirty money. Patricia begins to wake. Her fingers brush the fabric beneath her, and her past life as a maid kicks in. High-grade Egyptian cotton. It does not just lie over her, it swallows her up, acting like a paralyzing drug to keep her docile. She has been dropped right into a golden cage. You and I have probably learned this the hard way. The traps that finally catch us are almost never made of rusted iron. They are woven out of the exact comfort we have spent our whole lives begging to find. Let us break this shot down piece by piece. Patricia is frozen on the mattress, locked in a pure survival state. Since she cannot see, she starts mapping the room like an investigator. She feels the heavy chill of the air conditioning and smells the rich scent of old cedar wood. The carpet against her bare heels feels unnaturally thick. Then the dead quiet breaks. A man speaks from the far corner. His voice is smooth, paced with the horrible patience of a hunter who knows he has already won. "You took my train," she whispers back. She keeps her voice completely flat. It is a fake shield, a tragic attempt to hold onto some tiny scrory into a corner. Sometimes our only armor is refusing to let the monster see us sweat. "You took my lap," Paul answers, his words hanging in the black space. The camera pushes in, highlighting his absolute control. He stands, his footsteps swallowed by the sheer size of the room. He stops exactly 8 feet away. The distance is deliberate, near enough to make her feel hunted, but far enough away to stall her panic. We hear the soft clink of a cup touching a table. The rich smell of warm coffee drifts over to her. It is a psychological trap to make her drop her guard. There is a contract on the table, he tells her, showing zero emotion, but Patricia stays perfectly still. She would rather go thirsty than take his gift. It is a hard lesson we all must learn. Real power is refusing a warm meal when it is handed to you by the person holding the blade. I am blind, she tells him. I am aware he fire her fate. Those was not fate. This was not random. He picked her on purpose. He lays out his sick proposal. 1 year trapped inside this beautiful room for $5 million. But the horror is hidden in his rules. She keeps the money even if she falls for him. When she asks what happens if she simply leaves, the room feels colder. He casually brings up Mark. He reminds her of the abuse, the empty bank accounts, the miserable life waiting outside. He frames himself as her only escape. We see this mental trick in our own lives all the time. Evil rarely drags you kicking and screaming. It just convinces you that the raging storm outside is much deadlier than the fire burning inside the house. Watch how the poison of his control begins to work. The coffee is getting cold. Her hand reaches out and finds the cup perfectly, despite her lack of sight. It is a terrible mistake. She just proved how capable she is, and Paul quietly stores that fact. The bitter flavor hits her tongue, reminding her that he owns everything she experiences here. I want to go home to Mark, she tells him. It is tragic to watch her pick a hell she understands over a gilded cage she does not. We often run back to the people who hurt us, just because we already know how to survive their brand of pain. Paul does not yell. He simply agrees. The utter lack of pushback hits her like a brick. She expected a war. Instead, he just opens the door, a terrifying move meant to completely shatter her sense of reality. Let's unpack this moment together, you and I. She forces her feet into worn-out shoes and steps into the screaming chaos of the city. The contrast hits her like a physical blow. Just moments ago, she was in the quiet comfort of a velvet tomb. Now she chokes on exhaust and winter rot. Sliding into the hired-on car, Paul leans close for his final move. The number is in the right pocket, he murmurs. Notice he says, when you are ready, never if. That quiet confidence belongs to someone who knows how to exploit vulnerability. As the car melts into gray traffic, her shaking fingers already reach for that pocket. It is a harsh truth of life that sometimes the very lifelines we believe will save us are simply new, invisible leashes, binding us to a beautifully disguised cage. The pure cashmere coat draped over her shoulders is heavy. It acts as a physical embrace, a constant whisper of the safety Paul offers. For 7 long blocks, she forces her hands to stay still in her lap, refusing to reach down. But her mind is already turning against her. She cannot stop measuring the quiet, cedar-scented halls of Paul's estate against the cheap liquor and explosive anger waiting at Mark's place. By the 7th corner, her resolve finally breaks. Her hand drifts down, fingertips grazing the thick, expensive paper of his business card. She just holds it there in the dark. Life teaches us early on that people will often cling tightly to a beautifully wrapped poison, simply because the cure feels too unfamiliar and terrifying to swallow on our own. Watch her approach the rusted door of her reality. Every motion reveals the deep scars of pure survival. She bypasses the metal lockbox, choosing to dig her key out from under a broken concrete step. A lockbox clicks, and she knows that tiny sound will wake the angry beast inside. Scraping that key from the cold dirt buys her exactly 3 seconds of silence to catch her breath. She presses her cheek against the chipped wood, closing her unseeing eyes to map the room purely through sound. A sports game blares. A heavy glass slams against a wooden table. The air itself feels suffocating. It reminds us of a painful, universal truth. A home must be a sanctuary of rest, never a daily psychological battlefield where a person is forced to endlessly brace for the next terrible explosion. The brass knob turns and the door winds open to reveal the sluggish breathing of her abuser. "Where have you been?" Mark barks from the dark corner. It is never a real question with him. It is a psychological ambush. We watch her face as she buries her fear, freezing her features into a mask of cold stone. The cheap sofa groans loudly as he shifts his weight. "I got stuck on the train," she lies, keeping her tone totally flat so he cannot find a spark to ignite. He spits the excuse back, twisting every syllable just to make her shrink, before demanding her daily money. She only made $61 today. The bill is $78. It serves as a sobering reminder that financial dependence, most effective chains ever forged by human cruelty. The dead silence between them is heavy with malice. Mark slams his glass onto the table, a violent crack that forces a flinch from her shoulders. It is a classic warning shot. He complains about his hunger, expertly twisting his own laziness into her personal failure. When she quietly offers to cook, he lets out 14 steps to the rusted counter. 14 steps to the rusted counter. 7 steps to the stove. She moves through the dark with the tragic grace of a ghost haunting her own existence. While filling a glass from the tap, her breath suddenly catches. The very air in the room has shifted. One of the greatest lessons of survival is learning to never ignore those quiet internal alarms. Because trusting your own intuition is often the only shield you have left. Stick with me here, because this is where the balance of power fractures. She stands frozen, dissecting the room layer by layer. She registers the low static of the television and the wet, rhythmic anger of Mark's breathing. She smells the greasy takeout he ate while she was gone, a casual cruelty she has learned to accept. But beneath that stale grease, her senses pick up something deeply wrong, a scent that has no place in this tiny apartment. Very slowly, she turns. She masks her approach, gliding toward the sofa like someone trying not to startle a venomous snake. The camera pushes in close on her trembling fingers as they brush the torn cushions. Life teaches us that sometimes the smallest out-of-place detail is the exact catalyst we need to finally wake up and shatter our own chains. You and I are going to unpack this scene together. Notice how her fingers barely graze the unfamiliar cashmere on the armrest. Then comes the scent, an expensive perfume that violently clashes with her crumbling apartment. Another woman was in her sanctuary. The betrayal is total, yet watch her face closely. No cinematic tears, no sudden gasps. Her expression turns into a lifeless fortress of stone. This is the tragic reflex of someone who learned long ago that showing vulnerability only invites a heavier blow. She swallows a grief that could easily drown her, refusing to let the monster sitting 3 feet away see her bleed. It leaves us with a difficult truth. The quietest reactions often hide the deepest wounds, and sometimes survival simply means remaining perfectly silent. "I am going to bed," Patricia whispers into the heavy room. Mark offers absolutely nothing in return. That silence is his final, killing blow. She drifts through the suffocating dark, finding her tiny sliver of the mattress. Staring at the pitch-black ceiling, she refuses to pull the unwashed blanket over her shivering shoulders. Right there, the dam finally breaks. It is not the cheating that shatters her spirit, nor the unpaid bills. It is the crushing, hollow neglect of it all. She realizes that real love is meant to nurture you, not grind your soul down into dust. She has been watering a dead garden for years. The truest lesson of heartbreak is that sometimes you must stop clinging to a familiar cage and finally choose the path that might let you breathe. The camera pushes in on a quiet revelation. Patricia slides her trembling fingers into the pocket of her dark wool coat, brushing against the heavy cardstock. The mere weight of that paper feels exactly like Paul himself. It is magnetic, dripping with the terrifying confidence of a man who owns the city. Outside their window, the neon-lit asphalt hisses with winter rain. She listens closely to the heavy breathing of Mark beside her, confirming he is completely asleep. Only in that stolen moment does she let her fingertips trace the raised numbers, burning them into her memory. She will wait 4 days in these shadows. It is a harsh reality of human nature that a broken person will grip the bars of a familiar cage, simply because the open sky feels much too terrifying to face alone. The scene opens on a tight shot of cheap, wilting carnations on the counter. Patricia grips the cold ceramic vase, her knuckles turning bone, white under the harsh, buzzing fluorescent lights. Mark lingers in the doorway, a hollow painted smile plastered across his face. She can smell the toxic plastic wrapping of those flowers, a bitter stench, desperately trying to mask his endless, suffocating lies. She does not scream at him. She simply nods. You and I need to look closely at quiet moments like this to truly understand the anatomy of a broken spirit. Her silent acceptance is never foolishness, but rather the agonizing exhaustion of a soul worn down to nothing. Life teaches us a tragic lesson here. We often smell the poison in the soil long before the garden completely dies. By the third sunset, the walls of the house have closed in completely. The phone line to her sister goes dead with a sharp, metallic click echoing down the hallway. Driven by pure desperation, with her shaking hand dials Paul. The line connects instantly. There is no greeting, just the heavy breath of a predator patiently waiting in the dark. Minutes later, a black sedan idles at the curb, its driver wrapped in absolute silence. Sinking into the dim light of the back seat, Patricia pulls a soft cashmere throw over her trembling shoulders. She craves the warmth of the very man who orchestrated her capture. It is a heartbreaking picture of human fragility. The most painful lesson we face is realizing that a rescuing hand reaching into the dark can so easily lock the door behind us. The camera follows her hesitant steps into the sprawling glass penthouse. Even though her eyes are clouded in permanent darkness, Patricia feels the crushing weight of the room. Paul entirely consumes the space. She catches the dark scent of rich wood mixed with dangerous intent. His voice strong. You waited 4 days. A velvet blade cutting right through the engineered silence. The shadows stretch out, swallowing her whole as she sinks into the cold, imported leather of his chair. Far below, the muffled sirens of the city fade to absolutely nothing. He has perfectly isolated her from the world. A crucial truth of life reveals itself in this quiet terror. True power never needs to raise its voice. It just builds an impossibly beautiful room and quietly locks you inside. A heavy, mechanical click echoes through the vast room as Paul presses play on a silver recorder. He commands her to listen, and the heavy silence finally shatters. Within 3 agonizing seconds, Patricia's breath catches in her throat. The tinny voice pouring from the speaker belongs to Mark. He is speaking to a lawyer, his tone entirely flat and dead. The camera lingers on a single tear sliding down her cheek as she realizes her entire marriage was a beautifully constructed coffin. This was not sudden anger. It was a slow, venomous execution. We are forced to look at a terrifying reflection of humanity right here. The true monsters do not lurk in the dark woods, waiting for midnight. They sit quietly across from us at the breakfast table, smiling as they drink their morning coffee. The recording grinds on without mercy. By the 7th minute, Mark says the words cognitive decline. By the 9th, he brings up power of attorney. He is calmly building a cage of legal paperwork to bury his wife alive. Through the camera lens, you and I watch Patricia completely freeze. She does not sob or collapse. She sits with a terrifying, marble stillness, her unseeing eyes fixed straight ahead. It is the tragic defense of a wounded animal pretending to be dead, so the predator walks away. Every word on that tape is another brick sealing her tomb, yet her face remains an absolute mask of stone. It serves as a harsh reminder for all of us. The most fatal wounds a person can suffer will never spill a single drop of blood. Instead, they freeze your soul from the inside out. With a harsh snap, the tape finishes. The silence that follows is thick enough to choke on. Patricia's fragile posture shatters, her shoulders collapsing under the crushing weight of a decade of lies. The entire foundation of her life turns to ash in an instant. The camera shifts to Paul. He remains draped in shadows by the massive window, silently watching the rain beat against the glass. He does not rush to comfort her. He simply lets a heavy, leather-bound document slide across the glass table. It is a masterful stroke of dark psychology, offering a secure life raft to a drowning woman. This quiet tragedy teaches us something profoundly uncomfortable. The deepest bonds of loyalty are rarely planted in the warm sunlight. They are grown right in the smoking ruins of a broken heart. The tight shot frames her delicate fingers brushing the cold glass table until they touch the thick barrel of a Mont Blanc pen. It feels like pure gravity in her hand. With a hollow chest, she drags the nib across the heavy paper, signing away her freedom in 2 clean, desperate strokes. Patricia steps off the cliff into the dark. "Day 1, Paul murmurs, his voice a low tremor vibrating right through the floorboards. She is trapped again. But the twisted irony is that the sterile chill of this towering high-rise feels far safer than the warm house she left behind. It is the ultimate, quiet tragedy of human survival. When your spirit has been crushed into dust, merely understanding the edge of your new prison can trick you into into believing you are finally safe. The screen fades in and out, showing the agonizing passage of 3 days. Patricia moves like a ghost through the massive penthouse. Walking barefoot, she counts every step, her hands trailing lightly against the cold plaster walls. She learns the sharp acoustic echo of the marble kitchen, the way the morning sun warms the rug by the east window, and the heavy creak of the study door. Most importantly, she learns the terrifying electric charge in the air whenever Paul walks into a room. She is rewiring her broken soul to survive the rhythm of a new predator. There is a terrifying beauty in watching a human mind adapt to its own ruin. We have an astonishing ability to survive pitch-black darkness, just as long as we can memorize exactly where the walls are hiding. The camera glides through a massive, dimly lit closet. Patricia runs her pale hands over rows of expensive garments. Soft cashmere, freezing silk, stiff leather. As she touches each piece, a chilling realization washes over her face. Every single item is tailored to her exact size. He had been watching her, measuring her life, long before she ever knew his name. She swallows the rising panic, letting the dark romance of her captivity wash over her. She simply folds herself into his world, fading into the shadows of the penthouse like a phantom. She chooses to become invisible. This reveals a painful reality we must all accept about the deepest forms of control. Real manipulation never arrives as a violent shove. It always arrives as a warm, heavy coat, gently draped over your freezing shoulders. 2 months vanish. The camera frames a heavy oak door swinging open into a private windowless conference room. Paul guides her inside, offering no comfort, only the unspoken demand for absolute obedience. Patricia, dressed flawlessly in a dove-gray blazer, listens. She counts the heavy scrape of wooden chairs, 8 men in total. The air is thick with expensive cologne, stale breath, and the stench of dirty money. Stick with me here, because this is the exact moment she turns her weakness into armor. She simply pours a glass of ice water and vanishes into her own profound stillness, becoming a shadow in the corner. It is a brutal law of survival. When you are thrown into a pit of starving wolves, the smartest move is to let them forget you even know how to bite. The camera slowly pans across the hardened faces of the syndicate men. They glance at her unseeing eyes and instantly write her off as a broken doll. To these men, a blind woman is just another piece of expensive furniture decorating Paul's empire. Patricia absorbs their quiet contempt without a flinch. She lets the insult pass right through her, focusing instead on the raspy, arrogant voice of a man named Doyle. He laughs as he openly brags about smuggling shipments out of Newark. Another voice casually drops the name of a bought-and-paid-for politician. They speak freely, utterly blinded by their own immense pride. We learn a profound truth about human nature here. Pure arrogance acts as a blinding fog. Give a man enough pride, and he will gladly hand you the very knife to cut his throat. Look closely at the deliberate framing here. You and I are going to unpack this together. The men hover over the table, blinded by greed, dismissing the quiet woman sitting inches away. They view her as an empty shell, a broken bird kept for Paul. But watch the camera tilt down to her coat. Hidden inside, her thumb moves with quiet fury across a silent braille device. She captures every whispered betrayal, every shipping route, every flaw. 3 decades of darkness forged her patience, teaching her to stay perfectly still while her mind raged like a wildfire. True power never announces itself. The simple truth is that real strength often grows in the quietest margins. The less space people think you occupy, the easier it is to memorize exactly where to strike. The seasons slowly bleed together. Over 4 tense meetings, Patricia builds an invisible map of their syndicate within her mind, cataloging the blood money and buried threats. Paul never demands this. He merely observes from the shadows, waiting to see if his captive bird remembers how to hunt. One rain-soaked evening, she drifts into his dim study. Doyle is moving more than timber through Newark. Her voice cuts softly through the gloom. The scratching of Paul's heavy pen stops dead. He already knew the secret, but she just proved she is a lethal asset. The lesson we can take from this is simple. Never wait for the world to hand you permission to be valuable. Gather your spark in the silence, and only show your hand when the fire is ready to consume them. Picture the cinematic weight of this scene. You and I are going to unpack this dynamic together. Dim light slices across a heavy desk. Notice how Patricia keeps her tone completely hollow. Third chair, left side herringbone jacket. The dead silence from Paul is not a simple pause. It is the terrifying mental recalibration of a crime boss updating his reality. "Sit down, Patricia," he orders. She finds the leather chair, feeling its cold surface. From the beginning, he demands, driven by a toxic need for submission, "Tell me everything." She folds her hands in a gesture of surrender and begins. The lesson here is profound. True chaos, much like deep emotional trauma, rarely begins with a loud explosion. It almost always starts with a heavy, deafening absence of sound. The framing here reveals the suffocating markers of impending violence. Meetings cut short. Whispered phone calls echo down the hallway. A heavy suppression settles. The kind that happens when everyone knows a threat exists, but the narcissist forbids them from speaking its name. Patricia felt these shifts deep in her bones. She sensed the air pressure drop whenever Paul carried the weight of a failing syndicate. She never asked questions, understanding a very basic life lesson. Sometimes, unchecked curiosity does not just hurt you, It invites total destruction. She simply waited 2 in the morning. When he returned at 2 in the morning, she listened to his footsteps in the pitch black. It was the agonizing, heavy pacing of a wounded apex predator, desperately trying to conserve his last shred of power. The thick wood of the liquor cabinet creaks shut, leaving the terrifying stillness of a volatile man alone in the dark. The camera finds Patricia in the doorway, wrapped in a navy silk robe, a beautiful gift that functioned as a velvet chain. She offers him coffee. He mutters that she should be asleep, but she smoothly deflects. Moving to the kitchen, she pours 2 cups without asking. This shows how trauma binds people in tragic ways, forcing the broken to anticipate their captor's every breath. The painful life lesson here is that even the most brutal monsters secretly crave a touch of warmth, yet remain completely incapable of asking for it. She quietly places the steaming cups on the low table, immediately retreating to her designated shadow at the far edge of the sofa. Moments later, the soft rustle of expensive fabric confirms. He crossed the dark room. He does not retreat to the opposite end of the sofa. Instead, he sits remarkably close. She feels the heavy shift of his body weight, his radiating heat washing over her skin before he even settles. Through a cinematic lens, this tiny spatial adjustment is monumental. Over the preceding weeks, the texture of their shared silence had evolved. It began as the hostile quiet of a hostage standoff, bleeding into a numb coexistence. But tonight the silence holds a strange, pulling gravity. It teaches us a real truth. The heavy walls we build to keep the world out will eventually trap us inside. The crime boss has finally dropped his defensive perimeter, allowing her to breathe deep within his strike zone. "How many people know you are worried?" she asks, her steady voice slicing through the dark. When he whispers that no one knows, she realizes he has been masking a mental collapse for months. He offers no angry rebuttal. Instead, his trembling fingers turn his silver cup. The camera pushes in on the sharp click of crystal, striking his expensive watch. Every inch of Paul Sawyer's is a masterclass in deception. His tailored suits, his rigid posture, the absolute suppression of his soul. His persona was engineered to shatter enemies. But life reminds us of a quiet truth. A perfect mask is the heaviest burden a person can ever carry. Patricia sees right past the mobster. She only sees the fractured boy sitting alone at 2 in the morning, gripping a coffee cup like a lifeline. There is a faction encroaching on the port corridor, he confesses. His voice lacks its usual iron grip. "Stick with me." This is where the entire dynamic truly flips. What we are hearing is raw fear, bleeding through the cracks of his crumbling empire. He lays bare the exhausting paranoia of the crime boss. The reality of being hunted by your own men. Patricia sees the staggering depth of his isolation. A tragic truth of life is that true loneliness is not sitting by yourself, a portal you to fall. It is being surrounded by people who are waiting for you to fall. Outside the glass, a faint siren wails and fades into the rain. He weakly tries to reject her pity, but the lie is hollow. She unhurriedly lowers her cup to the table, her movements stripped of all tension, perfectly matching his quiet surrender. Over 4 grueling months, a twisted psychological root system had grown between them. It was cultivated in the shadows, forged through quiet rituals and the tragic vulnerability of a monster who finally closed his eyes. This is the dark reality of their bond. This is the dark reality where the captive slowly morphs into the captor's only sanctuary. "You do not have to be alone in it right now," she whispers. He stays perfectly still for what feels like an eternity. Then the camera catches the exact second his armor shatters. The heavy leather cushion sighs as his rigid spine slumps forward. He does not need to speak a painful word. Life teaches us a painful irony. Sometimes we seek salvation in the exact hands that broke us. His breathing slows down, marking the irreversible collapse of his mental defenses. I want you to think about the heavy psychology playing out in this room. You and I have probably both felt the crushing weight of a burden we could not share. The trembling sound of his breath is the raw auditory signature of a broken man letting go. They sit high in a glass tower, insulated from the bleeding city below. Paul, a tyrant who wielded fear like a blade, now sits defenseless beside a woman who cannot even see his face. The tragic life lesson here is that stripping away our manufactured power is often the only way we can rediscover our true humanity. Patricia listens to his chest slowly rise and fall. This is no sudden cinematic miracle. It is the heavy, inevitable fruit of their trauma bond, the most painfully real moment either of them had touched in years. She keeps these thoughts buried deep within the dark theater of her mind. The coffee grows cold on the table, and neither dares to break the fragile stillness. But peace is always a fleeting illusion in the underworld. She feels a violent shift in the room's pressure long before his armed guards do. This is not some mystical gift of the blind, a cheap, patronizing trope she despises. It is pure, unfiltered survival instinct, is that the painful scars of our past often become the tools that keep us alive tomorrow. At 11:43 at night, sitting completely still in the study, her mind acts as a radar sweeping the dark. The danger is already inside the fortress walls, and it is not coming through the grand front doors. The nightmare has arrived. A low, grinding vibration echoes from the utility shaft, exactly 2 floors beneath their golden cage. To survive, she had memorized every mechanical heartbeat of this building. This specific service elevator always groans with a heavier, delayed tension in its steel cables. She had cataloged this detail on her very first day. It offers a striking lesson in human nature. Arrogance constantly blinds the powerful to the tiny details that matter most. She slowly rises from her velvet chair. Exactly 4 seconds later, the entire power grid dies. The sudden pitch-black darkness crashes down like a physical blow on the confused guards. Down the hall, she hears Briggs, a massive bodyguard, screaming useless orders into a radio that the hit squad has already jammed to dead static. The heavy thud of combat boots, violently striking hardwood, echoed through the corridor. A second guard scrambled in the pitch black, his frantic movements exposing a mind unraveling from raw terror. When a priceless piece of Murano glass shattered, the truth became undeniable. He was totally lost. Suddenly, a deafening blast tore through the hidden service entry near the kitchen, ignoring the main doors entirely. The killers had been waiting inside the very walls. Patricia felt the primal urge to flee. Yet she rooted herself to the floor and began counting her steps into the absolute dark. It serves as a stark reminder for all of us. When chaos descends and the lights go out, surrendering to panic is simply the quickest way to lose your life entirely. Let us look at this terrifying sequence together, breaking it down piece by piece. Patricia took 12 calm, measured strides from the study to the edge of the sitting room. Turning left, she smoothly glided 4 steps past the heavy oak trunk. Exactly 8 perfect paces led her to the fireplace, where her fingertips found the freezing marble mantel right where she knew it would be. All around her, the room was drowning in bloody chaos. Through the screams of dying men, she tracked the methodical footsteps of 4 distinct killers, moving like apex predators. It reveals a quiet, enduring truth about human survival. When the physical world goes entirely dark, the only map will actually save you is the one you have painstakingly constructed in your own mind. Picture the scene with me exactly as the camera frames it. The lighting is fractured, pure violence bleeding into the room amidst the deafening panic. Patricia hears a heavy, sickening thud. Paul, the untouchable titan of this empire, releases a low gasp as his commanding presence is shattered by sudden physical agony. The great megalomaniac has fallen. Yet, Patricia sheds no tears. Operating entirely on cold reflex, her fingers sweep across the freezing marble of the fireplace. She traces 3 carved panels until she finds the 4th, pressing the invisible corner until the heavy stone groans open. It forces us to confront a brutal reality of trauma. The sheer act of survival often demands that we strip away our own tender humanity just to keep our physical bodies breathing. The heavy stone shifts inward, instantly devouring what little light remains. Searching the pitch black, Patricia locates Paul by the dragging rhythm of his boots. It is the undeniable sound of a broken man pretending he is not bleeding out. As hostile footsteps echo closer, Patricia does not break. She whispers a single, anchoring syllable, summoning the very monster who caged her. His trembling hand finds the doorframe, and she pulls him into the dark, her fingers immediately coated in the hot slick of his ruined flesh. The massive vault seals them inside a concrete coffin, leaving the camera to linger on absolute blackness. We learn a haunting lesson here. True trauma rarely bothers to scream for attention. Most of the time, it simply waits patiently in the quiet dark. The airless bunker presses against them like a suffocating weight. Pressed chest to chest, Patricia feels the frantic spike of Paul's breathing as he attempts to swallow his agony. Beyond the cold steel, invaders are violently tearing his empire apart, shattering glass. A deeper psychological tragedy unfolds. Here, Patricia does not weep or beg her for safety. Her nervous system has terribly adapted to his violence. She stands perfectly still, and Paul is absolutely terrified by her total lack of fear. She has completely normalized his nightmare. It exposes one of the saddest realities of the human condition. If given no other choice, our minds will eventually learn to turn a violent, terrifying cage into a perfectly comfortable home. Paul exhales his question into the stifling air, asking how she knew about the hidden room. Patricia answers with a devastating flatness, whispering that she knows exactly where everything is. As violent shouts bleed through the walls, the real shift in power happens right here. Paul Sawyers, the untouchable architect of her misery, has met his fragile mortality. He is bleeding out, stripped entirely of his grandiosity. The ultimate irony is that he now relies completely on the very woman he believed he owned. She keeps her hand pressed to his ruined arm, silently tracking his fading pulse. It teaches us a haunting truth. When everything is violently stripped away, survival becomes a quiet obsession with the few fragile things you can actually control. Stick with me here, because this is where the power dynamic permanently shatters. Paul is gasping, his breaths shallow as the deep wound above his elbow soaks Patricia's palm in thick warmth. In absolute darkness, she performs a silent triage. The blood is not pulsing. He will survive. Yet, she deliberately keeps this truth to herself, understanding that a shattered man cannot listen to reason while bleeding. Just inches away, his glorious empire is reduced to ash. The soundscape mutates as chaotic smashing fades into the disciplined thud of tactical boots reclaiming the floorboards. It reminds us of a profound reality regarding our darkest moments. Our internal fear will always broadcast a much louder, more terrifying echo than the actual threat standing right in front of us. The camera pushes in on Patricia's face, revealing a woman pale but terrifyingly calm. She calculates 5 as the heavy footfalls above. 4. The initial shock of the ambush has faded, replaced entirely by the cold precision of muscle memory. She tracks the violence through the deep vibrations, rattling against her spine. Her mind wanders to the expensive Venetian plaster behind her head, obsessively applied in 7 perfect layers. It was the ultimate monument to Paul's desperate need to control his world. Now that monument shudders under the boots of killers. It delivers a harsh but necessary life lesson. No matter how much wealth we gather to build our perfect, impenetrable sanctuaries, it only takes a single spark to burn them down into primitive hunting grounds. Inside the suffocating darkness, the wounded apex predator stirs. Paul attempts to shift his heavy frame, but Patricia's fingers dig into his bicep like iron claws. She hisses a single commanding word, and amazingly, the tyrant freezes. He does not surrender out of submission, but from a tragic realization. The woman he broke is now the only one who can navigate the dark. Though trapped in a concrete box barely wider than a coffin, the invisible crown has quietly passed from his head to hers. Months ago, in isolation, she memorized every survival tool on these shelves using only her fingertips, preparing for a war he arrogantly ignored. It serves as a brilliant reminder for us all. Real power is never freely handed over by our oppressors. It is patiently and methodically stolen in the dark. The camera acts as her mind's eye, mapping the pitch-black shelves. She visualizes the medical kit on the second tier, ignoring the flashlights beside it. She knows a sliver of light beneath the steel door invites certain death. In this breathless intimacy, she studies the ruined titan beside her. Paul has always been a creature built on kinetic violence. Over 7 agonizing months, she memorized his every cruel micro-expression. Now, his absolute stillness feels like a live bomb locked inside a velvet box. Desperate for a spark, yet fighting every toxic instinct he possesses, he finally surrenders control to her. It highlights a beautifully devastating life lesson for us all. True survival often demands that we completely burn down the stubborn, blinding pride that normally keeps us standing. You and I have witnessed this exact tragic reversal before. Patricia absorbs his quiet surrender without an ounce of joy, knowing there is no triumph in becoming the master of your own hell. Beyond the heavy steel, a sharp voice slices through the dust. The massive front doors groan open and slam shut as the hostile boots retreat. Soon, the rumble of Briggs's voice echoes, confirming the perimeter is secure. The bloody chaos evaporates, leaving behind nothing but the miserable chore of survival. Patricia's muscle memory flawlessly takes over. Reaching blindly, her fingers hook the latches of the medical case, pressing it against her hip to muffle the snap. It reveals a somber truth about the aftermath of violence. In the heavy wake of tragedy, absolute discipline is often the only thing that keeps the human heart quietly beating. She demands his wounded arm with the cold authority of a surgeon. Paul obeys instantly. There is no fragile ego, no bitter defiance from the fallen king. He surrenders his bleeding flesh to the dark. Patricia grasps his arm, tracing the torn muscle with heartbreaking detachment. This is the numb precision of a woman who accepted long ago that nobody was coming to save her. The wound is brutal, but it will not claim his life. She wraps the bandages with mechanical focus, perfectly separating the monster from his injury. Yet, the weight of his presence remains maddening. She feels the heat radiating off his skin, his invisible stare pressing heavily against her face. It leaves us with a haunting lesson to ponder. To gently heal the very hand that continuously strikes you is perhaps the most profound and painful of all human tragedies. Let us look at this exchange together, you and I. We see Paul whispering into the dark, stunned that she found him in the chaos. His voice has lost its theatrical poison. Patricia tightens the bandage and hands him a chilling truth. She knew exactly where he would stand because she spent months studying his shadow. She maps out his predictable arrogance, always hovering near an escape, projecting absolute dominance. The silence that follows is the sound of a false realizing he bleeds. He chokes on his failure, admitting he swore to keep her safe. Patricia agrees, perfectly dry and tearless. Here is a lesson for all of us. If you want to outlive a terrible predator, you have to be patient enough to study their shadow until you master the darkness completely. Patricia's cold confirmation hangs bitterly in the stagnant air. Then 3 rhythmic knocks strike the heavy steel door. It is Briggs. Patricia takes a graceful step back, giving the broken king a tiny fraction of his ruined pride. Paul pushes the hatch open, letting a sickly amber light bleed into their dark tomb. The camera trails him as he steps into the wreckage of his pristine life. He stares blankly. Countless pieces of shattered glass cover the floor. His flawless, untouchable crime empire has been humiliated and wiped out in a mere 12 minutes. The tragedy of a man obsessed with power is beautifully simple. It takes only one brutal moment of violent chaos to teach us a hard truth. Total control over our own fate is always a fragile, temporary illusion. Paul stands paralyzed in the suffocating silence of the room. When he finally turns to face her, the tension between them is heavy enough to touch. His iron grip on his own emotions has violently shattered. She feels the burning weight of his gaze, yet she completely refuses to offer the mercy of a confession. Speaking the truth of their bond too early might break its fragile architecture. Instead, she steps out of the shadows and directly into the amber glow of his ruined empire. Her trembling hand traces the battered drywall until her fingers find her cane. She plants herself firmly beside her captor amid the broken glass, offering only her quiet presence. It is a harsh reminder for us. Sometimes, shared pain can forge a chain far more lethal than simple hatred. Standing in the graveyard he built, he breathes a single word. Patricia, stick with me here, because you and I are going to look at this tragedy together. It perfectly shows the quiet, invisible trap of a trauma bond. He spoke her name with that flat tone typical of a master manipulator. Patricia simply turned toward the sound. Day 366 arrived the way profounds usually do, entirely without warning. For a full year, she tracked the shifting morning shadows and the pacing of the craftsman, driven by the obsessive vigilance of a captive. Her body absorbed every inch of this beautiful prison. This happens when a victim stops fighting the cold walls, stops looking for an escape, and learns to speak the twisted language of their cage fluently. The lesson here is devastating but real. Pure survival will sometimes trick us into loving the exact thing that is quietly destroying us. She sat perfectly still when Paul walked into the room at 9 in the morning. His movements were frighteningly deliberate, projecting the chilling calm of a man who firmly believes he dictates reality itself. He sat across the heavy table and placed an object down between them. Patricia did not try to reach for it. Her conditioned passivity held her entirely frozen in place. "The year is fulfilled," he announced softly. "The threat is neutralized." He explained how Doyle's arrangement had been dismantled, detailing how the Port family reached terms back in September. When he reminded her she was present for 2 of those coercive conversations, she quietly agreed. An account was now funded with $5 million. Here is something we must always watch out for. What looks like a simple business deal is often a tragic display of total psychological control. "The transfer clears today," Paul stated. Letting a heavy calculated pause hang in the cold air, he pushed the contract forward, telling Patricia she was finally free to walk away from it all. Outside the glass tower, the indifferent November morning rolled on. You could hear the distant percussion of construction crews, and blaring cabs, completely blind to the profound emotional capture happening high above the street. Slowly, Patricia reached out. Her fingers found the thick paper, tracing the worn fold lines born from a full year of anxious consultation. She mapped the surface completely and methodically. We can all learn something deeply human from this small action. When confronted with the terrifying prospect of sudden freedom after months of psychological subjugation, we will instinctively ground ourselves in tactile reality, desperate for any anchor. At the bottom of the page lay her signature, identical to the mark she made that first morning, while the fresh trauma of recorded audio still ravaged her nervous system. Holding the document, Patricia's mind regressed back to the old days on Delancey Street. She remembered the wobble-legged table and the $61 crumpled in her apron. That former life had been systematically hollowed out by Paul, a man who coldly weaponized her blindness as a tactical vulnerability. She remembered waking up that first night in his rebuilt apartment, wrapped in expensive sheets and an engineered silence that carried a heavy, invisible price. She thought of the memorized shipping contacts and the terrifying sound of Doyle's breathing, documented in her Braille shorthand. The hard truth is this: when your back is against the wall, every small detail becomes a desperate tool for pure survival. Patricia remembered the claustrophobic 3-foot panic room and how Paul had extended his arm to her in the dark without facing any resistance. She fixated on the amber-lit quality of his voice when he said her name. We can clearly see the deep roots of severe Stockholm Syndrome taking hold here. Much like the tragic tale of Luca and the infamous Mafia kingpin Vittorio, Patricia interpreted her captor's predatory focus as genuine affection. She finally believed she was being seen rather than simply watched. Society had always monitored her with a gaze of pity reserved for the fragile. But Paul's dark attention felt dangerously different. She tragically mistook the weight of shared mornings and cold coffee for true intimacy. We have to remember that isolation warps the mind. It is frighteningly easy to fail to recognize the manipulative architecture of a master captor at work. I want us to really look at how Paul framed his absolute control. He stocked her closet with garments organized by occasion, presenting his domination over her space as a caring form of logic. He would sit quietly in the dark at 2 a.m, displaying a highly calculated vulnerability. He knew exactly what she was capable of, because a true predator always studies their prey. Yet, in the quiet of that glass tower, Patricia rationalized his manipulation. She reached the tragic conclusion that after 31 years of being looked past, she had spent 8 months being truly known. The devastating reality of a trauma bond is that the captive cannot easily walk back from this distorted perception. The lesson cuts deep. A person starved for genuine connection will often refuse to trade toxic validation for $5 million and a lonely, empty freedom. In a gesture of surrender masked as personal empowerment, Patricia grabbed the paper and tore the contract in half. The sound was crisp and final. The thick paper resisted for a moment before yielding completely, serving as a perfect metaphor for her own shattered defenses. She placed the torn halves on the heavy table, folding her hands with a chilling compliance. The room fell dead silent. "Patricia," Paul whispered, using that hollow, late-night voice. "I am aware of what I am doing," she countered, demanding her choice be noted on the record. She proudly declared she had $5 to her name, but held more intelligence about his criminal operation than anyone in the city. She kept her voice perfectly level, clinically detached from her total subjugation. We learn a sad truth here. We will often try to intellectualize our worst choices just to retain a fragile sense of control. I am staying because this is the only room where the lights being on or off does not change what anyone sees, she told him. This rationalization highlights a deeply painful truth. Victims will frequently sacrifice their actual freedom just to secure the comfortable illusion of acceptance. Paul exhaled with the dark satisfaction of a conqueror. His heavy hand reached across the table, covering both of hers. It was the exact same hand that forcefully pressed her down on a midnight train, operating under the twisted guise of keeping her safe. He held her hands in total silence, fully knowing his physical dominance spoke much louder than his words. Here is the tragic lesson you and I need to take away from this. True safety will always empower you to confidently walk out the front door. It never conditions you to willingly lock yourself inside your own cage. Slowly, she turned her hands over, returning his grip and sealing their trauma bond. High above the distances separating healthy individuals, Patricia sat entrenched in the engineered isolation of the glass tower. She felt a quiet, devastating certainty moving through her bones, the absolute delusion that she was exactly where she decided to be. She convinced herself she had not fallen into a predator's snare, but had actively chosen this cold captivity. The torn contract remained on the table like a discarded lifeline, and neither made a move to clear it away. This is the ultimate victory of a megalomaniacal narcissist. They rewrite a victim's reality so thoroughly that the captive fiercely defends their invisible chains, fully believing they forged the iron locks themselves, a flawless, tragic capture. Remember this, above all else, we must always question the cages we feel safest in.